Hello everyone. This is a video overview explaining what an annotated bibliography is, why we're doing it, and where we need to be before we can even start talking about this. At this point, you should already have a working thesis statement, and it should be a debatable claim about some aspect of happiness. Remember that it must be debatable because this is a rhetoric class and all we write are argumentative style papers. So we can't write anything that lends itself to just explaining or exposition, something that will lead to a report. It has to be something that somebody could potentially take issue with and develop arguments in opposition to whatever it is that you have claimed. So you need to have that debatable working thesis statement, and you also need to have your 7 official sources for the paper. And those 7 sources can't be randomly chosen. They need to be things that would actually help you sustain a paper on not only the subject of happiness, but the debatable claim that you've chosen and done enough research for and found those articles for. Remember that 4 of your sources minimum must come from the STC databases, and you do have to be careful and make sure that you have read the written lesson on evaluating sources from the databases, because all that glitters is not gold, and just because something is in the databases doesn't by definition mean that it is good, relevant, or suitable to use in a paper. And there are some banned source types, and you certainly want to know what those are, because you don't want to choose a source and then end up using it in your annotated bibliography or your paper only to discover that you can't use that type of source and you need to take it out and find something else. So at least 4 have to come from the STC databases. You can get all 7 if you want, but at least 4 have to come from there. And the other 3 can come from the TED website, which stands for Technology, Entertainment, and Design. And you're also welcome to use anything that I have put in the course. The 2 articles that I've placed, for instance, the TED videos that I've placed in the course, you're welcome to use those as well. But we can't use just random sources from the regular internet. Alright, so I do have an explanation here in the written lessons about the different kinds of annotated bibliographies there are. There are some that scholars write, and then there are some that students write, and then I make some modifications to the kind that students write to suit the purposes in this class. So let me bounce over here to a file where I have the start of an annotated bibliography to show you what I mean. We have it, the file is double spaced and in MLA format, like all the typed things that we have in this class. And notice that we have the heading, we have a descriptive title, everything is in Times New Roman, and there's no extra spaces between the line breaks. Everything is uniformly double spaced. At the top of the annotated bibliography, we have the working thesis, and remember the working thesis has to be a claim about happiness that's open to debate. The purpose of the annotated bibliography is to present that working thesis to a professor and also to yourself, right? Because you can't really start writing the paper at all until you have that thesis in place, until you have the sources in place, and then later until you have the outline in place. But this is a preparatory step before we get to the outline that will help you think through the basic points of your essay. So this will or should, if you invest your time and energy and follow directions and don't just do it to do it, it should help you think through the points that you need to have in doing this. And then you can also discover, after having created one of these, where the gaps are, the things that you've left out, and things like that. So we've got the working thesis statement there, and then what we have is a bibliographic listing of all 7 sources in MLA format. And so you do have to either grab those entries from the databases, or you've got to look up how to do entries for a TED Talk if you're doing those. And they're in alphabetical order. So as you do this, just remember they're in alphabetical order, that they're not in random order. In this example here, Hudson is the first example in the alphabet, and this is actually from one of the articles that we have in the class that you've already read called Beyond Happiness, the Upside of Feeling Down. And this does tie into the working thesis that I have, but let me explain what the parts are. before we go back and take a look at maybe one full example. So we have the thesis at the top. We have this article, which I intend to use in this paper, the bibliographic entry for that. What you see in black here is a third-person summary of the article capturing the main claims, and it's written in third person with no opinion, and it's very direct and to the point, and it doesn't say this article talks about this and it talks about that. It doesn't bounce around. It's a very good, very tight summary written for somebody who has not read that article. When you hand your annotated bibliography to somebody else, they haven't read the articles that you have, they haven't seen the videos you have, and so for them to be able to look at and see whether or not what you have makes sense or not, you've got to tell them what you have, what it's about, and what your vision for that is. So this is a way for you to present not only your thesis and your sources for me and for yourself, but it's also an upshot summary of what they're about, and also a very specific, not as specific as an outline, but still a very specific explanation of how you intend to use those sources in your paper. So we're going to look at maybe one example together before I tell you some things that you need to know before you start creating this. So let's take a look at the working thesis I have here. It is kind of wordy. I probably will tighten that up as I get closer to the outline and drafting and so on, but for right now it's fine because it's debatable, and that's what we need here. So my working thesis statement is that despite our universal desire for it, happiness is not naturally in the cards for us. To be human is to suffer, struggle, endure, adapt, and survive. However, that does not mean it's completely illusory or elusive either. If we learn to broaden our definition, manage our expectations, and train our minds, not only to endure the suffering that will surely come our way, but to put it to good use. Okay, so then if we look at this first example, we've already read this. We know it's going to be relevant. But let's pretend for a moment you didn't know what this article is about. I've got a summary here that says this article makes the case for the value of human negative emotions, not just for human growth and development, but also for happiness. So notice that I start out there with the main claim so that I can kind of give the upshot of the rest of it. It counters the idea of emotions being inherently positive or negative and points to the value of a wide range of emotions, some of which are unpleasant to experience, but which provide practical, social, emotional, and cultural value. A separate case is made for each of a series of emotions commonly perceived as negative, including anger, jealousy, envy, suffering, and grief, among others. All right, so that's kind of the upshot of it. I'm explaining not only is it about the value of human negative emotion, but what that relationship is to happiness. So the part in blue is where I have to explain, well, how am I going to use this to develop some point in my paper? This is where I'm writing. I can use a little bit of first person here because I'm explaining to myself and also to a professor or whoever else is reading this, a tutor, a friend, a colleague, to see, like, hey, does this make sense? Is this clear? Not only to me, but to others. Of particular use to this paper are the arguments about suffering and grief, shame and guilt, and the one that points to a narrow and negative view of happiness, which makes it possible to explore not only shallow definitions of happiness, but also arguments about ways in which certain notions or pursuits of happiness are not always desirable or beneficial. Specifically, I intend to develop a point countering the notion and primacy of happiness as an emotion, make a case for the greater value of other emotions to our character development, wisdom, and empathy, and use that as a springboard toward broader notions of happiness that are more sustainable and realistic because they're not temporary as all emotions are. So let's unpack that a little bit. So I'm telling not only how I'm going to use it to develop the point here, but I'm also pointing to the fact that I'm going to use this to springboard to an argument of definition that argues that happiness, the way I might define it, goes beyond emotion, and that I have a broader, deeper concept of what happiness is that is not confined to the idea of just feeling good or getting what you want. So a lot of things going on there, a lot of good things going on so far. All right, I'm also going to use the other source that we used in our hypothesis assignment, the Quest for Happiness. And before I explain how I'm going to use it in that paper, remember I have to be able to explain to myself and to somebody else who has not read the article, well, what is this about? And so this one, I have this article argues for the necessity of exploring happiness as an idea from a historical perspective so we can trace not only its evolution but also its trajectory. Ancient philosophers like Aristotle and Cicero distinguished happiness from modern notions of happiness as an emotion or passion, anchoring it instead in the idea of a life of virtue and duty, not devoid of pleasure or joy, but one that requires sacrifice, discipline, pain, and suffering. Kant, like others, noted the irony of our desire for something that is so hard to define precisely, as evidenced by the litany of definitions and ideas we can trace over time, from ancient Romans and Greeks to the idea of happiness as an idiosyncratic and subjective pursuit of pleasure, an idea or a deferred reward for religious piety, and the subsequent and more recent flip of deifying and worshiping the notion of happiness itself. So here I have to explain how am I going to use this to develop that thesis that I had at the top of the page. This article can provide concrete background on the varied, overlapping, and often contradictory ideas about what happiness is, if it is possible, and if it is even a worthwhile goal. This will help establish the debatable nature of happiness and its definition, which I will need to establish the definition for in my paper, even though it's not an argument of definition per se. Specifically, I will focus on ideas by Freud, Jefferson, and others that happiness, in the sense that most people mean it, is not in the cards for us and that it's not our normal or natural state, nor is it a right, but neither is it out of reach completely either. And I will potentially use ideas by Alexis Tocqueville, specifically the tendency to pathologize unhappiness and the allusion to this in Huxley's Brave New World in other sections of the paper. So this is just a little handout that I create for my classes. It's only got 2 entries on it. Yours will have all 7 entries, and I wrote these by hand. So I grabbed the entries from the SEC databases, put them in Times New Roman, cleaned up the formatting so that I have the hanging indent here so that the entry starts flush on the left-hand side, and I have these over here. Everything's formatted correctly, and I wrote these summaries myself. And I did this and I timed myself, and it took me about an hour to develop a thesis and write these 2 summaries and a brief discussion of how I envision using them. But if you count the time that it took me to find those articles, read them, and annotate them, it took me a whole lot longer than 2 hours to do this, if you count that. Now for our assignment, I'm going to give you an option to automate part of this. It's going to save you a lot of time, but it's not meant to be a shortcut for your engagement and your deep understanding of the articles that you have chosen. But what I wanted to show here is what it is and what it entails if you're doing it, completely by hand. But the method that I'm going to show you in just a moment, I'm going to show you how to automate, and you already know how to do this. I'm going to show you how to automate and cite the top portion, which is the summary part. This is the part that's very vital for you to get right, and it's the part that's very vital for a professor to see in an accurate form, because if you provide an inaccurate, incomplete, or somehow problematic summary, then it makes it very hard for somebody else to evaluate not only its relevance, but it's also hard for them to evaluate your grip on that article. And that'll become apparent too in the blue part when you write that. But this is what an annotated bibliography is, and the next thing I want to show you is how to automate it and how to cite that. So give me a moment to kind of switch gears and bring a few other things to the screen. Okay, here I'm inside the assignment link for the annotated bibliography for the essay, and this does have an AI option to automate the summary portion of the entry. So this should save you a fair amount of time. It's not hard to write a summary, but it is kind of hard to write one that is very good, very clear, very tight, and that doesn't bounce around and say things like this article talks about this and it talks about that. You have to be able to identify the main upshot and the argument and be able to present that in a very concise manner. So it is an option to automate. If you want to do it by hand, you can, but just make sure that they are accurate. And, obviously you can generate those summaries in Claude. You can generate the summaries in ChatGPT. You will need to supply your threads for that. Actually, you don't have to supply your threads for that because you're going to be citing that, and I already know that probably most people are going to do that. So it's okay if you don't submit the threads for that. I've got the directions through here about how to do it and what you've got to do in order to cite it and in terms of how to do that. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, here I have scrolled to the bottom of the assignment link for the annotated bibliography, and I have a couple of handouts here. Keep in mind that these handouts just have some sample entries. They are not the complete thing. You must have a complete annotated bibliography on one file with all 7 sources in alphabetical order. So it's going to be kind of a long document, but keep in mind you are going to be allowed to use AI for the summary portion, but not for the part in blue where you're explaining what it is specifically that you're going to use in the paper to support given points in your thesis. So let me open this bottom one that has some examples, or at least I've got one example of an automated summary, how it's going to be cited, and you've got choices in terms of which platform you want to summarize the article. It could be done by ChatGPT, it could be done by Copilot, it could be done by Claude, and I'm probably going to show you one other platform that you will probably find useful at some point during the writing the process work for the essay. And so even that one is fine too once I show you how to do that. Let's take a look at this one. I've got a different working thesis on this one that says Hegel's view of happiness from a historical perspective is a good lens through which to view our own relationship with happiness. It is not or should not be the goal of either history or human life. So notice here it's a debatable claim. I'm saying that happiness should not even be a goal in human life. And so I've got to make a case for that. My subject is still happiness, but I'm taking an opposition to the idea that this is something that we should be actively pursuing. So I've got my first article here, and I am citing it up front this way, and I'm saying summary by Bing Copilot, and then in parentheses I'm putting the publisher of that or the company behind that, which would be Microsoft. Now I wrote this myself, but just to create this example I put a heading with Homer Simpson on here, and I put lightly edited by Homer Simpson. Even if you just put summary by Bing Copilot or summary by Claude, and if you put Claude, you'd put Anthropic in here. That's the company that makes Claude. If you put summary by ChatGPT, then you would put OpenAI in here, and so on. And then notice I also have a footnote down at the bottom here so I can indicate how much of this entry is summarized by AI and how much of this is edited by me. So if I read this is what the AI wrote, and then we'll look at the note down here. The article discusses Hegel's philosophy of history and his justification of human sacrifice as a means of historical progress. The author argues that Hegel does not regard individuals as mere instruments of reasons, but as valuable ends in themselves who participate in a reciprocal relation with the universal. Novakovic also claims that the scope of human sacrifice is narrower than it appears, and that Hegel's project aims to reconcile us to the evils of history by showcasing their rational necessity and a positive contribution to human freedom. The article engages with various objections to interpretations of Hegel's philosophy of history and tries to mitigate some of the moral qualms that raises. Now, this article, was kind of long and it's dense to read, and it's about this philosopher's philosophy of history. But I'm going to use this and as a lens through which to make an argument about happiness. And believe it or not, I got this idea right here about Hegel's view of happiness from the Quest for Happiness article. And so I've got my explanation there. But notice here I say the summary here presented in black font is verbatim from Copilot. However, I changed the phrase the author to Novakovic, which is the author's name. The part that follows in blue is an original description of how I intend to use this source to develop the thesis of my paper. So again, that's just one example there. You will have 7 contiguous entries, one right after the other in ABC order with the summary and a very specific explanation of how you will use it to develop a specific aspect of your paper. So if we look at that here, you'll see how am I going to make sense of this article that's really about this philosopher's take on an aspect of history and how that applies to happiness. I want to use this source to first present his claim that happiness is not the goal of history and why that is, and make a connection to the idea that happiness should not likewise be the goal of our lives for similar reasons, that true growth and progress comes from conflict, struggle, and sacrifice. I won't argue that happiness is impossible, but I will use this to develop a different concept of happiness that isn't tied to emotion or pleasure per se, but rather to something more meaningful than that. I would also like to explore his claims about the role of self-consciousness and agency in history, again making similar claims about their role in our lives and in our happiness. So notice that my explanation of how I'm going to use this is a lot clearer and more simply stated than just the straight upshot of his article. I know exactly what I'm going to use from the article, and I'm going to make it plain and simple, and I'm going to use that as a lens through which to make these claims. So this is our goal for the annotated bibliography. The option to automate the summaries will save you quite a bit of time, but I want to clarify that in order to do this, you cannot choose articles that you have not read. You cannot choose articles that you've only skimmed, or that you only read the abstract for, or that you only know it's about happiness. You have to have processed the articles well enough to figure out, A, do I understand what this is about? If not, you should never ever choose something that you don't understand. You can't use it in your paper if you don't understand it. And so if it's too hard to process, put it to the wayside and find something else, or spend the time to figure it out to determine if you want to use it. So you have to choose things that you actually have deeply read and that you've understood. You will not be able to write a very good paper if you are not deeply invested in the sources. Even though the paper's not about the sources per se, it's about your argument, but you have to be able to use these sources in a meaningful way, and that does not mean going in and I'm just going to throw in a quote for the paper. You have to be able to have at least 40 to 50% of your paper coming from meaningful use from the sources, so you have to know them really well. And you also have to know them well enough to figure out, well, how specifically am I going to use that in my paper? So when you get to the blue part in the annotated bibliography, just remember that you cannot say, I plan to use this source to back up my claims. I already know that. That's too broad, and that's not very helpful at all for you or for me. So you have to be able to explain pretty precisely how you intend to use it for a point, how that may connect to something else, and so on. You don't have to use AI in the summary portion. You can do it all by hand if you want. Some students prefer to do that, and it's actually a very good thing to do. It really does force you to know the sources very well. But I'm okay either way as long as you do know the sources well. All right, that's it. That's in a nutshell what the annotated bibliography is and why we're doing it, so that we can see a basic plan from the paper. And this is kind of a pre-step in the writing process before we get to the outline. From this, you and I both can already see some of the points that will emerge here, and can also start to maybe see where some of the gaps are and see if anything needs to be filled in. All right, so that's a wrap. Let me go ahead and stop this so I can process it and get it out.